So I got fired. Yeah, I know. Super sad. So I should be a little more disheartened and depressed. But considering I only worked for this company for about a week, I'm not all that sad. However, in the moment, I was incredibly frustrated because getting fired brings a lot of emotions. And especially in the moment with me thinking of my beautiful wife and our two little girls. What am I going to do? How am I going to provide? How am I going to make sure that we have food on the table, a roof over our head, all the questions that may be asked. But to give you some backstory here, so when I first started with the company, the employer said you'll be making about $3,500 up to $6,000, and it will be uncapped, so you can make $6,000 plus. I was like, perfect, this is awesome. Then come to find out that I would only get $50 per call that I scheduled because I was basically a salesman. And then I found out that they only book about 19 calls a month on average. Now, if you do the math, that is not $3,500 a month. It's a pretty minuscule amount.
Wasn't going to cut it.
It wasn't going to cut it at all anyways. So I asked the employer a bunch of questions as he's basically going through like, oh, you're going to lose your job. Then he finally comes out and says it at the end, and he goes, well, quite frankly, you deserve more. I was like, yeah, you're right. I do deserve more. But that doesn't disregard the fact that I did feel incredibly discouraged and disheartened. And it made me ask the question, why me? Why does this have to happen to me? Why did I have to go through this? And so that's what we're actually going to encompass today and really talk about, is the question of why. And in particular, why do bad things happen to good people?
And this is a very common question that I think, and in fact, I know a lot of people ask.
Right.
And today we're going to give you an answer. So why do bad things happen to good people? Well, the answer is because they just do. Because life is unfair. Because whether you are a good or a bad person, it doesn't matter what kind of person you are, you're still a person. And because of that, none of us go through this life without facing, discouragement and setback and failure and loss, because that's just the name of the game. Mm-hmm. And even though this reality might seem harsh, it doesn't have to be, because today we are going to offer you 3 approaches that can combat and help you to be able to put yourself in a better frame of mind when you are going through the pitfalls of life, when you are finding yourself stuck in a bad time or a bad thing. So these approaches are: number 1, keep an eternal perspective; number 2, understand prayer; and number 3, turn lemons into lemonade. So, without further ado, let's jump into principle number 1, which is keep an eternal perspective. Mm-hmm. And as Christians, one of the things Elijah and I believe in is that one of the best ways to cope with the unfairness of life is to turn to your faith and to keep an eternal perspective. And to do this, first we got to kind of understand the backstory of suffering.
Yeah. So when it comes to suffering, there's really 3 reasons why we suffer. First is the actions of others and the consequences that come, because God gives us all agency. Second, the action of ourselves, because we also have our own agency and we screw up a lot. And third is sometimes we just don't know. We do keep that eternal perspective. However, we might not see it as clearly as obviously Heavenly Father does, or our God above. And so when it comes to that, people do have their own agency. They can screw up and cause bad situations for us or for others. We can screw up and cause bad situations for ourselves and suffer the consequences. And then other times it's just to help us grow. It's to help us mature. It's to help us to experience what God has for us in this life and in life to come.
Right. And although suffering is inevitable, there's one thing we do know, and that is that Christ overcame all. So even though life is unfair in this moment, we know that in the end, everything will be made right through Christ.
Mm-hmm.
That one day, all of the things we don't understand, will come to light. That we will know, and all the pieces will fall together, and we'll be okay with what happened.
Yeah. And I actually want to reach out and say this to especially anybody who's suffering with an illness or has somebody that they love that's suffering for an illness. And I know it's difficult. I know it's really hard. But what Meg just said is the crux of my testimony and of hers, is that Christ has suffered so that he knows exactly what you experienced and that you have somebody to turn to. C.S. Lewis has this beautiful quote, and he came to this conclusion when he watched his wife die of cancer. And it reads, "But pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world." And so when it comes to that, when we do go through suffering, when we do go through heartache and pain and sorrow and grief, we can turn to God. And in fact, he expects us to, because he is a loving Heavenly Father, and we should turn to him, especially in our time of need.
Right. So now that we've established that suffering is just a part of life, it helps us to keep what we like to call an internal perspective. And as Christians, we can believe that these years that we spend on this earth, while they're important and to be used wisely and to be enjoyed, we know that they're just in preparation for a greater life to come. So the years on this earth are a thin ray of light from the great sunshine that is eternity and life in heaven with God. So even amidst suffering and pain here, we know that through through this pain, we are only gaining experience, and it's for our own good because it's preparing us for a life to come and a life to spend with God.
Mm-hmm. So there's a really, really beautiful story, and this puts us right into prayer.
Principle 2, yeah, prayer.
Principle number 2 of understanding prayer. And it's about this boy who goes to war. He enters the army, and it's during World War II. And his mother is speaking to him, and she says, "My boy, you are going a long ways away from me now. Do you remember that when you were a little lad, you used to have bad dreams and get frightened? Your bedroom was just off mine, and frequently you would cry out in the night and say, 'Mother, are you there?' And I would answer, 'Yes, my boy, I'm here. Everything is all right. Turn over and go to sleep.' You always did. Knowing that I was there gave you courage. Now," she said, "you will be about 6,000 miles away, and though you may cry out for me, I cannot answer you." Then she added this, "There is one who can, and if you call to him, he will hear you when you call. He will respond to your appeal. You just say, 'Father, are you there?' And there will come into your heart the comfort and solace such as you knew as a boy when I answered you." And that's really the crux of what we want to talk about when it comes to prayer, is this opportunity that you have to always turn to your Heavenly Father. Just as this boy did when he went off to war, just the same way that he called on his mother when he was in dire need, and when he was frightened, when he was afraid, when he was scared. We can call on our Father in heaven, and we can turn to him in all ways, shapes, and forms.
I think that prayer is sometimes super misunderstood. And so in this section of the podcast, we hope to, just enlighten you to really like the depth of prayer and what it really means. So personally, I used to have this very immature understanding that if my prayers weren't answered exactly the way I wanted them to be answered, then I just had this false assumption that they weren't being answered at all. So if I prayed for a specific answer and I didn't get it, then I just assumed that God wasn't listening and he wasn't answering my prayers. And this is completely false. Just because God doesn't answer your prayers the way you want doesn't mean he's not answering them. And there's also there's this beautiful quote from one of the leaders in our church, and it reads, "God hears every prayer we offer and responds to each of them according to the path that he has outlined for our perfection. It is for reasons known only to God why prayers are answered differently than we hope. But I promise you they are heard and they are answered according to his unfailing love and cosmic timetable."
So it actually goes right back to kind of that story that I mentioned right when we started to speak about understanding prayer. And when this boy was frightened, God came to him in solace and comfort, but he didn't take away the fear.
Mm-mm.
He didn't banish away the darkness, just as the little boy's mother didn't do. She just reminded him that she was there, and that alone gave him courage. And so, how does God answer our prayers? Well, it's the same way that parents answer questions to their kids. And what we found is that there's probably around 4 ways that a parent or God answers questions and appeals. 1, with the answer of no, which is the hardest one. 2, with the answer of yes. 3, with the answer of it's up to you. And 4, not yet.
And understanding these answers, putting them into these categories, what it's done for my life is I can go back and then I can recognize how God has been answering my prayers.
Mm-hmm.
Even when the answer isn't yes, there's still an answer. And so that helps me to have a better relationship with him because I personally can recognize. So Elijah and I are going to share some personal stories of when our prayers were answered, just so that you guys can hopefully, recognize like those same answers in your life.
Yeah.
So I'm going to cover the hard answer of no.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to do that, I'm going to share a story from my own life that I haven't actually shared on a podcast just because it's very close to my heart and it's actually something I'm still working through probably every day. So long story short, in high school, I discovered the sport of track and field, and I fell in love with it, and I put a lot of my energy and my time and mostly like every waking moment into the sport. And it became clear to me in high school that, because of the success I was seeing there, that I was going to have the opportunity to run in college. And in doing so, I was like, okay, well, if I was able to come from this tiny town and make it D1, why wouldn't I be able to, start at a college and make it to, maybe the Olympics or some, go big. So anyways, I graduated high school and I joined literally my dream team in college. And I went and I started to run and it was amazing. And what happened was, logistically, cuts had to be made, and this was for a lot of reasons. Over-recruiting, COVID, there were a lot of reasons why cuts had to be made. And because of how young I was on the team, my lack of experience, it became obvious that I was one of the top candidates to be on the chopping block. And recognizing this, of course, I immediately started to earnestly pray every day that I would be able to stay on this team and that I would be able to fulfill my dream and my passion of running and get to just stay on this journey. And I prayed and I prayed and I worked and I worked and I did everything I knew how to do. And I ended up getting cut. And it wasn't like this gentle cut. It was kind of a slap in the face, like, you're done. And you're not going to run at this school ever again, and you can just give up on this dream. And at the time, I was so angry, and I was so sad, and it really shook my faith, because I was like, this is something that I believe in so much, and how could God take that away from me? How could he how could he not answer my prayers and keep me on this team? Like, I've worked hard, I want it so bad. And now, as I've, moved on, and it's been, a couple years, I can see that his answer was no. And I can see that if I had pursued this dream of running, I know that a lot of other opportunities and current dreams that I'm living out probably wouldn't be. And, now I get to be a mom of my 2 girls, and I get to work on other passions and things that are lasting. One day you're always going to have to hang up the spikes, but the dreams and the things that I'm fostering now, they do have eternal value and significance, and they're never going to let me down like my sport did. And so I'm honestly thankful to God that he did step in and tell me no, even though, like, I get emotional right now because it's still hard. It is something that I loved so much. And becoming a parent to B and Winnie has helped me also to understand why God has to tell us no sometimes. So our babies are now at the point where they are moving everywhere. Like, this house gets lapped every day. There is just little busybodies everywhere. And as I'm, watching and taking care of them every day, there are times I have to tell them no. No, baby, you can't play with this outlet. You'll get hurt. We bought outlet covers, so don't worry.
Yeah.
But no, baby, you can't do this. Or, baby, I know you're tired. You have to go to bed. You can't stay up. And I think it's just the same as with us, where God can see into our future, and he's experienced all that we have. And so he can look at our lives and say, no, actually, you need to stop running. There's something better for you. And so that's really helped me also to be able to come to peace when the answer is no. So when Elijah got fired this week, I was like, well, obviously this answer to prayer and this job is a no. Mm-hmm. And so instead of dwelling on the fact that it's a no, like, let's move on to the next best thing, and let's see how God's going to answer this prayer in a different way.
Yeah, that was amazing.
Thank you.
So to go off of that, so the 4 questions, or the 4 answers that God tells us is no, yes, it's up to you, and not yet. When it's up to you and when it's yes, I feel like that's pretty obvious in everybody's life. The ones that are hard to deal with are the ones that Meg just expressed, the no and the not yet. Because the no is just flat out, I got to figure something else out to do. And the not yet is, okay, now I just have to bide my time. I have to wait. I have to keep working. I have to keep the faith. And so the example that we have when it comes to not yet is actually this podcast. So in many ways, this podcast is a great success. And to all of you out there who have hit the subscribe button, and if you haven't, make sure you do now. But for all of you out there, you have made this a great success. You have made this worth our time and worth our effort, because you're avid listeners. And we are so grateful for that. But in many ways, it's not a success yet, because we're always searching for more. We're always striving for better. We're always striving for improvement, as all of us should in every area of life. Because God is our loving Heavenly Father, and he wants us to strive to become more like him and his beloved Son. So we should always be striving for better, just as we do in this podcast. Now, when it comes to this podcast, it's a not yet. But that means you continually put in the effort, you continually work, you continually have the faith and the hope and the desire for more. And it goes back to a quote that I've said in this podcast before, and it's, because God delays does not mean that God denies. God helps those who help themselves. And a lot of times I think the best way for us to get answers to our prayers is not on our knees praying. It's actually when we're out working, when we're taking actions toward that which we desire. If we desire, me and Meg actually say this all the time, if we desire to have 1 million followers on our podcast, we have to give $1 million effort to our podcast. And that's what God expects. When we pray for success, whether it be in a podcast, whether it be in athletics, whether it be in business, whatever it is, he expects us to do half the work. And it's always the first half. So this actually counters right into another quote with our good friend, Mr. C.S. Lewis.
Yes, one of the ways to understand prayer is to come to know God a little better. And this quote we thought was so cool because
amazing.
I think it just like hits everything right on the head. So here we go. So C.S. Lewis says, "By the goodness of God, we mean nowadays almost exclusively his lovingness. By love in this context, most of us mean kindness, which is the desire to see others happy. Not happy in this way or in that, but just happy. What would really satisfy us would be a God who said of anything we happen to like doing, what does it matter so long as they are contented? We want, in fact, not so much a Father in heaven as a grandfather in heaven, a senile benevolence who, as they say, liked to see young people enjoying themselves, and whose plan for the universe was simply that it might be truly said at the end of each day, a good time was had by all."
What we want is a grandfather in heaven. And I can say I've been there.
Yes.
I'm still there in a lot of
Yes.
aspects. We want the Disneyland dad. The Disneyland dad who will say yes to everything, especially our greatest desires. But that's not always what we need.
No.
To give you an example of this, I actually was just up at my parents' house a few days ago. And we just finished dinner. I fed my little baby girl, and she's very happy, all the things. Gave her a drink of her water.
You know, fed her good food for
Yes.
her body. She's feeling good.
Right, she's 10 months old. I turn the corner, go away for 2 seconds, come back, and her grandfather is like assisting her just pound orange Fanta.
She's a baby.
She's a baby. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a stickler, and we give our
No.
babies, occasional treats, desserts, candy, snacks, all the
We're
things.
not crazy.
But I don't let her pound Fanta. Not as a 10-month-old. And as much so, her grandpa has every right to do that. Because he's the grandfather. He doesn't have to be the father.
He doesn't have to think of her health and her night because,
No.
he just gets to be
He
in the
doesn't have
moment.
to brush her teeth.
He gets
even though
to
it's
just
very hard.
he gets to just make her current present so great.
Right.
That's his job.
Well, it's just like the quote that C.S. Lewis said and that Meg just read. He doesn't care so long as that she's happy and that she's having a good time.
Right.
Right? And of course he cares about her well-being.
Oh,
That's not
yes,
what I'm
yes,
saying.
yes, yes, yes.
But overall, he gets to be the fun grandpa.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, that's not what kids need. As children of God, we also need to be parented and told no. And told yes, but also told this isn't okay. This actually goes right into the experience I had right before I transferred universities. So I had this feeling that I was meant to transfer for a while. There were very clear indications that I should not remain at Boise State University. The team wasn't going well. My own personal health wasn't going well. My own mental health wasn't going well. There was a million reasons
bad.
why I should not be there. But I wouldn't listen. So God was telling me, yes, you need to leave. Yes, you need to leave. And I prayed about it probably 15, 25 times by then. And I'm just kind of twiddling my thumbs, acting as if I didn't hear God's answer the first 20 times. And I remember this vividly. I was riding my bike home from a night class. And I was praying, asking that same silly question of, should I leave this university? And I remember that I was crossing a busy intersection on my bike. Saw that it was clear for me to go. Immediately get out into the crosswalk, and I get T-boned by a car. Mind you, I'm in a bicycle, on a bicycle. And my bike gets destroyed. I go flying. Thank heavens that it only hit my back tire. And I'm hyped up on adrenaline, so I wheel my bike for the rest of the way home. And finally, that's when I realized that I needed to transfer. But it took me getting hit by a car for me to understand that. And what was interesting is I ended up breaking my wrist. And I still, to this day, believe that it was God that hit me with a car.
I know it was, okay? I'm going to vouch for my husband. He's one of the most observant people I know, always. So for him to just not see a car coming is just kind of, it just doesn't make any sense, like knowing what I know about him.
So what's kind of cool about this story, though, is God loved me enough to hurt me. He loved me enough to cause a minor injury so that major injuries were prevented in the future. So that my life was now on the correct course. A simple broken wrist is better than a lifetime of pain and regret. The pain in my wrist now has ceased. However, if I would have remained at the place that I was, that pain would have been forever. It would have been lasting. And so what I found is sometimes a father needs to be stern. He needs to cause a little bit of pain. I'm not saying be abusive by any means, but he needs to cause a little pain so that you get put on the right course. 99% of the time, a father should use the still small voice and be very kind, loving, and gentle. But occasionally, he needs to use the voice of thunder and be a little bit stern.
Right, especially when you're not listening. I think a lot of this can be avoided if you are listening to what he is telling you and trying to like seek him out. But it's when we don't listen that he has to take other measures, and thank goodness he does.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's all of you can relate to that. Every single person probably on this earth with a good parent can relate to that. Yeah. Or a good parent in general can relate to that. I mean, I remember, like, even now, we're to the point with our little girls that we have to begin to parent them a little more.
Just a little bit.
Because they're starting to understand more. They're starting to get their bearings in life. And as Meg said, go for outlets and other things. But because of that, we do have to be a little more stern every now and then. Mm-hmm. We tell them over and over and over, and then they still don't follow through. And so it's like, hey, enough is enough. Like, I love you too much for you to, like, continue to do this.
Yes.
And so for any parent out there, and especially for anybody who's wondering whether or not God is answering your prayers,
he is.
Just listen. Don't be foolish like me and have to get hit by a car before you change your ways. That's the way that's the easiest way and the best way for you, is to listen the first time.
Right. Okay, let's move on to our final approach, which is turn lemons into lemonade. And this is a very common expression, but this section was inspired by Zig Ziglar. And he shared a couple stories in the end of his book of, perfect examples of people who took their bad times and made it into their greatest success. Mm-hmm. So we hope to inspire you with these last 3 stories, and then we'll wrap everything up. So the first story is about a man named Jacob Shix, and his lemon was a temperature that fell to 40 degrees below zero while he was prospecting for gold. And it was so cold he couldn't shave with a blade. So instead, he invented the first electric razor, which turned into a big enough gold mine for him to buy lots of lemonade. Cool story, right? He's out there finding no gold. He's at his lowest of lows. He's so cold. He can't even shave, but he takes that. He's like, oh, you know what? I could make this electric. And now he's worth probably tons and tons of money.
Millions upon millions of dollars.
The next story is about one of our favorite people, Mr. Abraham Lincoln. And today he is remembered as one of the greatest leaders of the United States. But his life had a lot of cul-de-sacs as he, was experiencing it. And he went to war as a captain and returned as a private, which is as low as you can rank in the military.
Got fired.
And he did. And it's literally the opposite of what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to get promoted, but he was demoted. And then, this was just the beginning of his experiences. He started and failed numerous businesses. He went bankrupt twice, and he was defeated in 26 of the campaigns he made for public office. And even though his personal story has all of these like bumps and hiccups, his presidency did change the course of history for the United States. And I think what's so cool is, as I'm looking at all of the, setbacks and cul-de-sacs that he did have to face, I know that the reason why he was such a stellar man and president is because of the experience that he gained through those really hard situations, and they only made him better. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think he was such a great leader.
No, I agree. I mean, it's like the quote, it's the finest steel is forged in the hottest furnace. I mean, that's Abraham Lincoln in a nutshell. There's also another story, and
this is my favorite.
Beethoven. He was literally a deaf musician.
Okay, just take that in for a second. He's a deaf musician. He can't hear.
He can't hear. And yet he composed some of the greatest music of all time. What's interesting, too, is that he was awkward on the violin to start. And back then, a lot of teachers and people didn't have a lot of empathy for kids. And so they just kind of like pushed him to the curb. And he continued to work and persevere and persist until he became known as one of the greatest musicians of all time. Then, in addition to that, we had Van Gogh, who didn't sell a single painting. Is that right?
I think he sold one painting. In his whole life.
And now every single one of his paintings is worth millions upon millions of dollars.
Everyone loves him.
Everybody loves him. And what's so amazing is these are just 4 people in this entire world who have turned their lemons into lemonade. And there are countless, millions upon millions of people who have done the same thing. And so we were actually just talking about this the other day, I think yesterday, on our drive. And I had a conversation with an individual, and they basically told us that we should settle, that we should be contented, and that we should look for our security and all of this other stuff. And me and Meg just thought to ourselves, like, no. Like, so many people out there have had a successful podcast. They've had successful companies. They've been published authors. They've been public speakers. They've accomplished this. So why can't I? Mm-hmm. I mean, as Meg just said, one of the biggest stories of perseverance was a deaf musician, and he became one of the greatest of all time. Was it Beethoven who did the dun 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 dun?
Dun, 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 dun. I think so.
I'm pretty sure it was either Beethoven or was it Mozart?
I don't know.
One of them.
We need to brush up on our music.
But my whole point is, if they can do it, why can't I? Why can't you? Right. Why can't any of us? They weren't just, they of course were unique and special, but so are you. Mm-hmm. So are we.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me too, I'm reading right now in a Jim Rohn book, which we're going to do a whole podcast on this book, but I think the biggest reason why people don't live up to their, full potential and, want and are really tempted to settle is because it takes effort to love yourself. It takes effort to believe in yourself. It takes effort to trust in God and to believe He's answering your prayers. But if you put in that effort, it will be rewarded because, again, keeping that eternal perspective, like as a child of God, there is so much capability inside of us. And none of us were meant to be settlers here on this earth. We were meant to, just bloom and blossom and just become the best versions of us.
Yeah. And I think that's the perfect way to end.
There we go.
Takes a lot of effort, but it's always worth it.
Right. So when you find yourself, down on your luck in these bad times, we hope you can remember the 3 approaches of, number 1, keeping an eternal perspective, number 2, understanding prayer, and number 3, turning your lemons into lemonade.
Yes.
So thank you so much for being here. We love you guys.
Listening
Yes, we'd love to hear from you, because if you have suggestions of things you want us to talk about, we would love to hear, and we'll totally make podcasts about them.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So make sure you hit that subscribe button if you haven't. You're the reason this is a success.
Yes.
You're the reason this is going bigger and bigger every week. So thank you. As Meg said, we love you. And until next time.
Peace.